Okay, welcome back, everyone. I want to begin with a question, and please tell me if you have an answer. How many different schools of economic thought are there?
20?
We have 20 and
35.
35,
What the
15.
15. A unique ideology about economics. Could be two. Only two, yeah. So maybe two, maybe 35. Honestly, I don't know. So I don't have an answer. But we will talk about some of them, the modern schools of economic thought. So we're going to look at how some of the schools differ, and yeah, we'll go into comparing them. But how do we distinguish these different schools of economic thought? Well, on one hand, we have the ontology, we have epistemology, methodology, normativity, and then what are the policy implications of these different schools of economic thought? So that's kind of how they differ. As we looked at earlier today, you had the pre-modern schools of economic thought, like the Greco-Roman period. The word economia comes from oikonomia, which means household management. So the Greeks were considering, how do you run a household? You have to economize the means you have available to you, including your money and your time, your resources. And then we have things that Mises really developed, which is catalysis, the science of exchange, which is the heart of economics. So that's more modern. We had the ancient Chinese with Lao Tzu, Chuang Tzu, Pao Ching, and some of them were considered even the first anarchists because they like this idea that the government that governs least governs best. So economics, when we classify it through this framework of investigating epistemology methodology, it's very philosophical. And then when you look at the policy conclusions, it becomes political. So this is what political economy is these ideas of mercantilism. Should we have a positive trade deficit? Should we impose tariffs on other countries? Political economy comes from economics. So let's begin with the classical school. So we've covered this already. I don't need to go too deep into this, but you have Adam Smith, David Ricardo. Adam Smith looked at how the market helps people through self-interest as if guided by an invisible hand, and David Ricardo and the idea of comparative advantage. But I'll get to some of the critiques a little bit later on. I just kind of still want to establish these different schools of economic thought. So from the classical school, we have the Marxist school. And I think it's important to note that Karl Marx was not the founder of socialism. He just developed a lot of socialism. There were socialists before Karl Marx. And they were very religious. Murray Rothbard writes a lot about how they had Christian influence. Even Thaddeus Russell talks about how, like, Christianity was, in a sense, it pioneered a lot of socialist ideology. And then what Karl Marx did was basically saying, instead of giving your life up for Christianity, you give up your life for the state. And so this is how Marx really kind of used a religious framework to create Marxism and this idea of collectivism or socialism and communism. But some of the aspects of Marxism is this idea of, the class conflict. You have the bourgeoisie, the proletariats, the bourgeoisie, the managerial middle class are exploiting the proletariats. So we need to have this revolution, in a sense. They were syndicalists. They wanted the revolution, as well as the labor theory of value, which was coming from the objective theory of value, that value is objective. I'll tell you a story that I got. I went to a bar, and this guy was writing, and he was typing, and I was like, "What are you writing about?" He's like, oh, I'm writing a book. I'm like, oh, that's very interesting. Like, I just got my first book published. And he's like, oh, what's it about? And I'm like, oh, it's about the economics of suicide, how the state is producing more suicidality. And he's well, like economics, like what kind of economics? And I'm like, Austrian economics. He's like, oh, I hate the Austrians. I'm like, why? Like, tell me why. And he's like, you guys just reduce things to number. You're very anti-human. And I was like, what do you mean? Like, we're not using mathematics here. We're just really talking about human action and subjective value. And the example I came to try to talk to this guy, I mean, we didn't have much of a conversation, but I had basically two drinks. And I'm like, if one drink's really good and one drink's really bad, I'm going to value the drink that's really good more. I don't want to pay $1 for a drink that's really bad. It's not worth it. But a drink that's really good, maybe I'll pay $10, $15. So this is the point of subjective theory of value. Even if people put both like the same amount of effort into making two drinks, it's up to me to decide what I like more. Maybe I like hamburgers over sandwiches because I don't like the tomato in the sandwiches. I get a hamburger, it's warm, no tomato. But this is the idea of the subjective theory of value that the Marxists and socialists forego. Not only that, I mean, there's a book by Nassim Taleb called The Bed of Procrustes, and this parable is the idea that there was this bed, and Procrustes, or however you pronounce his name, wanted people to fit the bed. So if they were too tall, he'd chop off their feet, and if they were too short, he'd stretch them out. So in a sense, yeah, you have equality, but is that a good thing? Are you more comfortable laying in a bed that you may fit, but your feet are chopped off, or you're being stretched out? So is that more comfortable? I don't think so. And this is the idea a little bit of this whole implication of socialism. And you also have this idea of historical materialism, which is still very prevalent in the whole modern idea of economic thought. It's this idea that there's stages. You have the lumpen proletariats, or the mercantilists, I guess, that lead to the capitalist stage. And then after the capitalist stage, you arrive at the socialist stage. But there's no arc to history in this sense. And the Whig theory of history is the idea that we're constantly making improvements. But as you see, like from the classical school to the Marxian school, to even the neoclassical school, this is not an improvement. We strayed from what the forerunners of real economic thoughts, like the school of Salamanca with the Spanish scholastics, the French physiocrats, and Menger himself began and started. So, I mean, this is Lenin, the guy who started the revolution in the Soviet Union in Russia, considered the first, I guess, socialist society. But let's continue with some of these figures from the 20th century. So we have the fascist school, or what's also considered corporatist idea of economics. And I think what's important to mention here is that the figures I have here are Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini, right? So they were considered fascists. What is fascism? Fascism essentially is, and this is the name of Nazism, National Socialism. This is not something that comes out of capitalism. Okay, this is something that is super inspired by Karl Marx himself. That's why this slide is following the Marxist slide. It is a variation of socialism. Fascism basically is the idea that you have private ownership, in title only, nominally only. But in reality, it's the state that determines who's going to produce what, at what price, who are they going to sell to, right? So it's essentially the state-run society, but with the nominal privatization in name only. So markets exist, but outcomes are politically constrained. Property is nominally owned, but there's political control. So Mussolini from Italy, Adolf Hitler from Germany, the Third Reich. So then we go to Keynesian macroeconomics. And as I mentioned in the first pillar, Keynes, not a big fan of. Ed Fuller writes a lot about John Maynard Keynes. Keynes Very interesting. Roy Harrod's autobiography, which, to my slight disappointment, Professor Pete Becky kind of praised as a great biography, but it's a total puff piece. Okay, Roy Harrod's biography of John Maynard Keynes was to pass Keynes as some father of capitalism. But Keynes, if you look at his papers, he said, we're non-Marxist socialists, but they are socialists. Okay, this is also conspiratorial. Like, he married a Russian ballerina. His father was, like, I believe, a card-carrying member. But the whole idea of Keynesian economics was, how can we arrive at this socialist society? And the way we do it basically is this demand side system, where we use government spending as essentially a way to socialize industries, socialize different firms and companies, to lead step by step to socialism. And in this sense, I think you can consider Keynes almost like a Fabian socialist, that rather by revolution, we'll do it step by step. And so the real problem you have here is when you look at something like the Great Depression. Okay, Keynes comes along and says, wow, we need like government spending, because if you stop government spending and you let people save, this is like someone who's obese and the solution is to starve. This is no solution. We can't let someone starve. But by the same logic, in a different analogy, you take someone who's hungover because they were drinking too much, and you say, wow, like, this person's really hungover. Like, we can't let them be hungover. So what are we going to do? Give them more alcohol, give them more drugs to keep the party going, because we can't let them feel bad. No. But this is the complete inverse logic that the Austrian School battles with. What we're saying is that actually, when you have a recession, it was from too much government spending, too much stimulus, too much drugs in the economy, this economy of heroin and bread. That's not a healthy economy. What you need to do is actually stop all this demand side supply of monetary and fiscal policy, and you need to let the market operate. I heard this from a farmer. I think it's almost very profound, when he was talking about the supply of milk and cows, and he said, you can't turn the cows off, so you can't stop the supply of milk. So high prices are the cure to high prices, and low prices are the cure to low prices. If you have high prices, okay, you can't have the government come in and say, well, these prices are too high. This is due to greed. This is actually evil. This is what is causing inflation, is high price corporate greed. So what we need to do is set a price control. What happens then? The government comes in, they set a price control. Maybe we could draw it on the supply and demand graph. And essentially, the marginal producers of milk, who can only make profits and revenue at that higher price, are now priced out of the market. They can no longer supply their milk. So what happens? They leave the market in the supply of milk, and maybe they go to supply butter or cheese. Now there's less milk in the economy. The whole goal that politicians were trying to achieve by imposing price controls actually created a worse problem. There's now more of a shortage of milk. So now people have to go to black markets. People become criminals overnight because of government intervention in the economy. And this is just one example. But yes, Keynes, he wanted this management. So then we get into the neoclassical economists, the neoclassical synthesis. Okay, we have here Alfred Marshall and Paul Samuelson. And I think, in a sense, the historical lineage from like Leon Walras and Stanley Jevons going to Alfred Marshall and Paul Samuelson is very interesting. And if you also keep in mind too, like, these pictures are becoming a bit more modern, right? So we're entering more into like the more contemporary day schools of economic thought. So Paul Samuelson has a textbook that's like in most universities and academia teaching. Is it Paul Well, now it's Greg Mankiw, but formerly it was Paul Samuelson. Yeah. Okay. So when you go to universities today, you're getting fed these ideas of neoclassical microeconomics. And the next slide is like a comparison with the Austrian school, or in a couple slides. But this neoclassical synthesis is basically a static snapshot of the economy. And it's saying, we have this homo economicus rational actor, and what we need to do is figure out where the equilibrium is and how can we pull certain levers using these mathematical formulas to achieve this utilitarian ideal static state. Okay, this basically is what at the highest level of economics is reduced to. It's just 700 level derivative calculus, and they're just doing mathematics. It's for failed mathematicians. So this is not economics. This is, look, he has these mathematical formulas behind him. Okay, so these are not philosophers in the Austrian tradition, if you will. Now we have the Chicago School, or the Chicago Boys, of Frank Knight, Milton Friedman, George Stiegler, excuse me. They basically were the idea of monetarism, this idea that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, the quote of Milton Friedman. And they weren't Austrians. They still wanted some government interventionism, but they are an existing school of economic thought. I recently, actually, at George Mason University last year, there was a fellow student that studies at the University of Chicago, and we were having a beer, and he's like, we were just discussing economics, and coming from the Austrian perspective, we were kind of debating a little bit. Also, to put into perspective, this is an interesting statistic that I believe it's for every 20 Keynesian economists, there's one Chicago School economist. And for every 10 Chicago School economists, there's one Austrian economist. So the Austrians are a minority, but that's not a bad thing. But anyways, we were just debating, and he was like, wow, like you're an anarchist out in the wild. And yeah, I thought it was funny. So then we get to the Austrian school. Okay, this is founded by Karl Menger, pioneered by his students Friedrich von Weiser, Egon von Bauer, and then Mises, and so many other Austrian economists since these guys. So yeah, we're covering this, but let's get into some more side-by-side comparisons, right? Maybe this will help clear up some of the confusion. So on one hand, we have the Austrian school. On the other hand, we have the Neoclassical school, consisting of the Monetarists and the Keynesians. The role of time. Time is very important. For the Austrians, time is it's a resource, it's a feature. But in this neoclassical synthesis, because they're taking a snapshot of equilibrium and trying to find equilibrium, time is ignored. This idea of equilibrium is so ephemeral that it's fleeting. How do I know like what I want next, in a sense? Like at one moment, I may want my temperature in my home or my car to be 1 degree, but then I may get too cold or too hot, so I change it. So my equilibrium temperature is constantly changing. Yeah, I don't know. There's some other good examples you can always think of in regards to like, wow, how ridiculous is this concept of equilibrium? Even style. Okay, I'm wearing this today, tomorrow I'll wear something else. So I don't want a one size fits all equilibrium idea. I think, think of if you had to figure out what everyone in the country wanted for breakfast tomorrow, this would be crazy. It would be socialism. So then we have this idea of capital. Capital is not homogeneous. I have in a couple of slides the production structure of capital. Karl Menger developed this structure of production and the stages of production, and it's very important that gets severely neglected in the modern neoclassical school. Production is dynamic versus this one-dimensional horizontal equilibrium. Money we'll have a whole pillar on money, so I don't want to get too bogged down in that. And capital savings, business cycle theory. We'll get into this more, but I just want to show you that there are many distinctions, very important to our understanding. Okay, so this is something that Hayek pioneered, as well as another student of Ludwig von Mises, Israel Kirzner, this idea of knowledge and entrepreneurship. What is the type of knowledge we're using in economics? It is a form of, well, it's, okay, not in economics per se, but in the role that the entrepreneur plays in the world is he has a type of tacit knowledge. What I mean by this is the know-how rather than the know-that. For example, to ride a bike, you have to ride a bike. You can't just learn it in a manual. To learn how to play basketball, you have to play basketball. You can't just think about it. You kind of have to do it to intuitively learn these things. And so basically this whole idea of knowledge, and probably in the future pillars, we'll discuss more about it, that knowledge can't be centralized. Knowledge is something that exists in the millions of minds of people, and even the most intelligent person in the world knows something that you don't. So entrepreneurs acting through a market society are coordinated by this price mechanism of profits and loss. Profits signal to other people, let's do this thing, we're providing value, this is good, and losses say, let's not do this thing at all, we're losing money, this is a bad idea. That's what so much of that type of feedback is guiding what's created in society. But when people no longer have like a market economy and they're dictated by socialism, or when money becomes politicized, you have these alternative signals. Okay, come back to this. This is just a point on methodological individualism, which is another key aspect of the Austrian school, that it's people, individuals that act, not states or societies. You know, when we say Russia bombed Ukraine, you know, we're not saying that like it was the state of, well, in a sense it was, but the idea of it being that like it was certain individuals pushing certain buttons that bombed other people. Okay. That's one point. This is what I want to get to now, the stages of production. So when you see actual voluntary net savings in a society, there's a redistribution from the lower stages or the final stages of production, which is like consumer goods. As there's a decreased consumption of consumer goods, the available money that has been saved can now go to a deepening and lengthening parts of investments in the structure of capital goods. So this is actually what grows the economy. So this is kind of the idea of supply side economics, or Say's law, that production precedes consumption. You want a deepening of the structures of production. On the other hand, you have the Keynesian macroeconomists who are saying, no, forget the demand side. I mean, forget the supply side. It's all about the demand side. We need to stimulate more spending. That's what drives the economy. Okay, but then you don't have as much innovation. Furthermore, you have a distortion of what people are getting. And this is the whole point of Bastiat's The Seen and the Unseen. And then Professor Per Byland's The Seen, the Unseen, and the Unrealized. Just because we pay someone to dig a hole and fill it doesn't mean we're creating value for society. And just because we break a window and say, well, look, this is business for a window glazier to come in and make a new window, means we're foregoing something else. Means we're foregoing the investment that could have gone to building new industries. And so you can take this to the extreme, like Professor Hoppe, who's saying, well, here's why we don't have flying cars. Maybe it was Professor Hoppe who made that point. But the idea being like, we're squandering so much wealth and we don't even know it. Because of these distortions in the market economy. Now, this is a graph of your production possibilities frontier, and how basically when savings is artificially created, if you will, basically by artificially lowering interest rates, there's a signal to entrepreneurs that says there's more resources available. So they take out these loans, they create these alternative investments, and this is the boom period of the Roaring 20s. Okay, this is what signals to people that, yeah, there's more savings, so we can make these investments. But what happens is, that's the inflation, is when you create more money out of this deficit spending. What happens next is an effect. Prices need to adjust over time. So when prices adjust and we don't have the actual savings to pay for all these resources that we thought we had available, then the bust comes. Okay, then the hangover comes. And this is the recessionary period that is actually necessary for an economy to become healthy and on track once again. And then lastly, I just want to mention two more schools of economic thoughts briefly. The Public Choice School from George Mason University, founded by James Buchanan and Gordon Tullock. And their whole idea is like, well, you know, politicians are people and they're self-interested too. But with politics and the legal systems, you can have centralized benefits and dispersed costs. You know, tax everyone 1% more. They don't really feel it. But the people who benefit from that 1% tax multiplied by millions gain a lot, right? Yet they still advocate for things like constitutionalism and whatnot. And then complexity economics, pioneered by Brian Arthur at the Santa Fe Institute. And this is becoming more modern. I mean, this is maybe the only photo that's colored. Eric Bainhocker wrote a book, The Origins of Wealth. And one of my friends and colleagues, Vicente Moreno Casas, is writing a lot. He wrote a book about complexity economics, but it's in Spanish, like La Economía Complejidad. And it's good. I'm still learning about the complexity school, but I think it's promising. I think it's just kind of an adaptation of the Austrian school. But this is where I'll end. So this is just some schools, some modern schools of economic thought. I don't think it's all of them. I don't know how many there are. I'm sure there's way more, but I think that is all. Thank you very much. Okay, questions? Yes.
Do you know the central theory or theories of complexity economics?
Well, from these bullet points, they really focus on this agent-based modeling, which I think goes from this this idea of methodological individualism and not looking at, you know, these graphs or like the firm, like neoclassical economics discusses, you know, the firm, how should the firm act? What are the supply and demand and production possibilities frontiers of the firm? So also the economy as an evolving system. To be honest, it's been a while since I've really looked into the complexity school. But yeah, I think it's mostly just agent-based modeling and economy as an evolving system. If that makes sense. Yeah. Okay, Sam, you have a question?
Yeah, I'm going to follow up on the complexity economics, even though you said it wasn't your strongest area. So feel free to just say, like, try and go find this yourself. But
Yeah.
I understand that there's an emerging school of economics, but it comes from people with backgrounds in engineering. Is this that school? I mean, a lot of these people, their backgrounds in engineering, because my understanding was that they saw more the feedback loops, and more, you know, engineering type aspects.
It may be. I definitely think that in the 20th century, you had economists like the neoclassicals who had what was called this physics envy, and they felt like, you know, the natural sciences and physics were real science and more prestigious than this social science philosophy type approach to economics. So I think, as Professor Don mentioned earlier, Herbert Hoover was an engineer, and so you definitely had an overlap throughout the 20th century of engineers and mathematicians entering the field of economics. Complexity economics, they also may literally be engineers. I think that sounds right, but I'm not 100% sure. I'll get back to you on that.
Thank you.
I think another thing about the complexity school, if I recall, is that they understand the limits of applying engineering to the economy, because the economy is a evolving dynamic system or process, or as Professor Byland mentioned, an organism. I think that's too human. It's a evolving dynamic process. Okay, there's no way to really control an economy. Economy is just another word for social cooperation. It's just people living and existing in the world and coming together in the market process. So unless you're actually social engineering, there's nothing to engineer, right? Yeah, I mean, with politics, you have more social engineering, but that's more like getting into the crony capitalism interventions.
If I were to want to learn more about complexity economics,
Yes,
are these
I
the
would.
two academics I look at, or what's the best book if I'm time constrained?
I would say check out The Origins of Wealth by Eric Beinhocker.
Thank you.
Ilya.
Oh, yes, Elia. Oh, you're muted.
Oh, hello. My name's Eli Atkins, and your name is
Right.
Doctor. What was that?
Well, I'm not a doctor,
Oh,
but Matthew. Call me Matthew.
Matthew. Thank you. Hello, Matthew. I have three questions. Well, it's a small one. What do you think of the Chicago School and Milton Friedman and the Chicago boys basically creating the Chilean miracle?
And the which miracle?
The Chilean miracle in Chile, which means well, I just go that's too much historical question, pardon me, but the main thing is really I want to ask, what do you think of the Chicago School and Milton Friedman?
Um. Well, I think the Chicago School, they're neoclassical, so they're still interventionists. They kind of understood that inflation is a monetary phenomena, but yet I don't think they went far enough, both in their application of free market economics and also their understanding of economics as not a neoclassical or um, empirical science. To me, it's still a deductive philosophy. So I have my disagreements with the Chicago School methodologically, and definitely politically. Milton Friedman advocated the was it the withholding tax that people should be taxed before on their income before they ever receive it. Um, Milton Friedman, I feel like, is like a gateway to free market economics, and also what was I heard this term yesterday. He's both a gateway and the gate. I think that's the term. That's he thinks that like that's as free market as you can get, right? Milton Friedman's quite popular, but then you have people like Hayek who are more radical, if you will, in their application of free market economics, and then even more radical than Hayek is like Mises. So to me, from my perspective as an Austrian economist, I think Milton Friedman is kind of not radical enough, if you will.
Thank you, Matthew. Thank you.
Yes. Okay. Any more questions? If not, I would just like to say that, well, I'll say two last things. One is the Austrian School, I think, is the most promising and strongest growing school of economic thought all over the world. Okay, this is a brand new institute, but in places like Auburn and in the US, but not only the US, Poland, in Spain, and different parts of Europe, in different parts all over the world, South America, the Austrians are becoming way more popular. So the school is growing. My statistic I mentioned of like 1/20th, 1/10th, I think is outdated now. And they're writing more. I don't know of any neoclassicals who will have the legacy that the Austrians will. Secondly, next pillar, we're going to have a very special guest, Michael Malice. So please, I don't know, look up Michael if you want and have some questions for him. But with that, thank you all for attending and your participation and questions today. So thank you very much, and we will see you in 2 weeks.
Thank you.
I've got one question if I can.
Oh, Sam, one last question?
Yeah. I'm just curious your own, even briefly, your own evolution in your thinking. I mean, when did you start? Did you start at a standard undergrad degree studying standard neoclassical economics, and like did you go through the Friedman gate?
Well, I think like, oh, okay. How do I say this? I started at Occidental College as a student. Probably many of you are undergrads, under Professor Darren Jurgen, and he introduced me to Austrian economics immediately. So yeah, I remember telling him at one point, I was like, I think Milton Friedman's my favorite economist. And I think you were kind of just like, but quickly I learned about Austrian economics and Mises and Rothbard and then Menger, and then you learn deeper and deeper about the Spanish scholastics, the French physiocrats. So at the same time I was learning Austrian economics, I was learning the neoclassical approach of microeconomics, macroeconomics, and at undergrads, if you're in those classes, you have to play the game. Okay, you may know that there's some flaws to it, but just ask questions. Don't stop asking questions. Think critically about like all these assumptions that are made. That we already, all the assumptions that are made is what it's founded on. But then you just have to look at the real world. Okay. So I went to Oxy, then Spain, and studied in what is like one of the only programs of a master's in Austrian economics, and now I'm working on the Ph.D. to become the doctor of economics. Yeah.
Okay, great. That's I mean,
Yeah.
God, lucky to be introduced at such a young age, I suppose. Yeah. All right. Great. Thank you. Appreciate it.
I'll say this: when I met Professor Huerta de Soto in Spain, and I told him like, yeah, I went to Oxy to study with Darren and learn Austrian economics, Huerta de Soto told me, "You're the luckiest student alive."
Yeah. Well, I think that's why the rest of us are here.
Awesome. Yes.
Menger Forum.
The Menger Forum.
I will send out an email.
Okay.
Yeah,
We'll have an email coming.
regarding Menger Forum.
Yes, regarding the Menger Forum. So stay tuned. Thank you all. It's super fun. And yes, excited to see you guys in 2 weeks. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Cheers.